It's a new year and it's a new cycle of Torah reading. This is very exciting, and it's been a lot of holidays. So it's great to have just a Shabbat. And as we're getting back into the new flow, or the old flow, the old new flow, alt new flow, something like that, I'm inspired to start with some gratitude, because I have a lot of gratitude at this time of year. And I want to start with some special gratitude to Cantor, to Rena Lee, and to Caesar. Because when I'm thinking of our community, I'm thinking these are the three people that if I'm going to make a mistake or have a quirk or need something or do something wrong or be they're the ones who have to deal with that on the front line. And you all support me so powerfully all the time in ways that I notice all the time, but maybe this community doesn't see all the time. And I have such deep gratitude for all of you. Thank you so much. And Caesar, I know you're here somewhere very, very, it's like he's always circling around. So I appreciate so much all of that you do to support not just the community, but me personally. So thank you. I want to also start with some gratitude, or continue with my gratitude to everyone who showed up for these Yom Tov services these past couple of weeks, everyone who took honors on Shmini Atzeret, Simchat Torah, and was just here in person and virtually. Gabbai, Hagbah, Lila, Aliyot, readings, these things are not so easy to cover at this time of year. Also, I want to continue with some gratitude for everyone who showed up for Hoshana Rabbah. The Minyanaires usually meet on just Mondays and Thursday, and this Hoshana Rabbah was a Wednesday, and we had 10 people, which was just an amazing thing. We were able to celebrate together, so thank you for that. Also, gratitude for our shamas, Jamie Knoll, and our immediate past shamas, Sandra Cass, who have been working overtime over these holidays. Our scroll master, Jonathan Marcus, who keeps track of the details in a way that I simply cannot with all the other details I'm keeping track of, so big gratitude. And of course, last and certainly not least, our board president, Marla Knoll, who represents our leadership and represents our community. Thank you so much for all you do in the spotlight and behind the scenes. So appreciated, so valued. Thank you. And so gratitude also for our Parsha. What a Parsha this is, Parashat Bereshit. And so we started the gratitude, and now we're going to move into a shameless plug. This is a shameless plug for my new class. This is the weekly warm-up. It's kind of a soft launch because, how many things can we really launch at one time? So a soft launch next Thursday, a week from 2 days ago, something like that, also known as Halloween, October 31st. It's going to be happening in the library. It's going to be in person only from 9 to 10 a.m. So if you're joining us virtually and you need some resources, or if you're here in person now and can't make that time, please email me and I will connect you with some great resources to study the Parsha in a different format. And so this is Parashat Bereshit this week, and so next week we'll be studying next week's Parashat Noach. So today's, and I did this once before a few weeks ago, but I'm going to do it again today, a little teaser for this weekly warm-up class and what it's going to be like. Clearly, it's not going to be the same format in the class. That'll be a 1-hour interactive discussion. And today, it's going to be more of a 10 to 15-minute presentation, and I hope we have some great discussion about it at Kiddush. Okay. So the biggest thing that I want to introduce about this format, and you might remember this from last time I spoke about this, we're going to start in this class, the weekly warm-up, with some Bikiyut learning, and then we're going to move into Iyun. So these are two different traditional ways of learning Torah. Bikiyut is an overview level. We're building vocabulary and we're developing literacy. It's a great way to warm up, and it's kind of where the class got its name, the weekly warm-up, because I love to warm up with Bikiyut. I think there's a lot of importance in building vocabulary and developing literacy because it allows us to have that deeper conversation that we can't have until we know the basics. And wow, in our Parashat Bereshit, there is a lot of vocabulary and literacy. There's so much going on in this parasha, and we're going to do a quick overview of it all. If you want to follow along with your eyes and not just your ears, I always like to make that option available. We're starting on page 2 or 3, or hopefully you can find it to the very beginning. Like Cantor was saying, it's a very good place to start. And so there's two, let's call this creation narrative number 1. We can unpack that for days and years as humankind has, but so briefly we'll just call it creation narrative number 1. God creates heaven and earth in 6 days and rests on the 7th. So we get to rest on the 7th. Definitely gratitude for that. Now, creation narrative number 2, God creates earth, heaven, and humankind. The first human we call Adam HaRishon, the first human. And God creates a garden in Eden, Gan Be'eden, which is a great place. And God gives us the first commandment, don't eat from the tree of Da'at Tov V'Ra. Don't eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And the first consequence of breaking that commandment is death. Well, and humans became mortal, so we all know how that ended up. And God also creates this thing for Adam HaRishon, this person for Adam HaRishon, Ezer Kenegdo, a helper corresponding to him. What exactly does this mean? We're still trying to figure that one out, and that's what the Iyun level of learning is all about. But so we're still we're still on the Bikiyut level as we continue to explore the parasha because there's so much in there. Okay, so after God creates all of that, then we have really the third thing, which is the first transgression. There were approximately 3 entities involved: the serpent, the woman's husband. Whose fault was it? We're still arguing about that. So we'll move on for now and continue the argument throughout the ages as we have. And then we have God interrogating humankind about what has happened, punishment, and expulsion. Expulsion from the Garden in Eden. And in this process, Eve gets her name, and Adam and Eve get clothing for the first time. So this is, if you've ever wondered where clothing comes from, it comes from Parashat Bereshit. Okay, so now that we're outside the Garden of Eden, things get even more complicated, exciting. We have the first offspring. Adam and Eve have some kids, the first siblings, and the first 2 siblings that are born result in the first murder, which is not a great statement for siblings throughout the ages, but we've hopefully moved on from there, at least mostly. And then also the first murder, punishment for murder. And then we have genealogies. We have the genealogy of Cain. Then thankfully Adam and Eve have another son, Seth, and his son. And at that point, we're going to come back to this a little bit later. We're going to highlight one detail. At that point, that Seth has a son, then humankind begin to invoke the Lord by name. So put a little post-it on that thought. We'll come back to it. We continue now with a book of genealogies, the 10 generations from Adam to Noah, and we read that this morning, and Sammy read it so beautifully in this laning. So the 10 generations: Adam, Seth, Enosh, Canaan, and this is the best name, and Sammy read it so perfectly, Mahalalel. That's a challenger. Yared, Hanoch. He's got a special story which we could investigate more, and we won't do that right now, but I kind of want to. Metushelach, Lemech, and then finally Noah. Noah, who is, I would say, the first hero, but we read more about that in next week's Parsha. Then we have this kind of fascinating interlude, and our Eitz Chaim calls it celestial terrestrial intermarriage, whatever that means. So we have the earthly creatures intermarrying with these divine beings, and we get really, really long lifespans. And then God is like, this is too wacky. We're going to put a stop to this. Human beings are going to live until 120. And we still say that today, like, may you live until 120. That's where this comes from. Okay, and now at the very end of the parasha, and we did read this morning because we're in the 3rd year of our triennial Torah reading cycle, God is like, I regret that I made humankind. Let's destroy them all. And as we were relating this morning, I really noticed that not just the people, but also the animals, Adam uvehema. Let's wipe it all out because this is not working. God regrets that God made this creation. But then Noach is our hero. Noach finds favor with God. And it's definitely like quite the teaser, quite the cliffhanger. We've got to wait until next week's Parsha to find out what happens with Noach. And that's our Bikiyut. Like I said, there's a lot there. And all these things in Jewish tradition, all these things in, I think, human tradition come from, or at least human cultural tradition and the cultural tradition that we're familiar with, or we're most familiar with, come from this parsha. Fascinating. Okay. So that's Bikiyut. We're building vocabulary, we're developing literacy, but the point of Bikiyut is not to stop there, it's to move into the Iyun level of learning. This is the Jewish learning par excellence. This is what Jewish learning is always going for. It's that deep dive. We're making new interpretations. A new interpretation is called a chiddush. That's something that's highly valued in Jewish learning. Personal and unique interpretations are much encouraged, and we acknowledge that there are multiple correct answers. Now, wrong answers are still possible. Just because there's multiple correct answers doesn't mean every answer is correct, but there are definitely multiple correct answers. So we're going to look at this a tiny little bit. And hopefully this is going to make us curious for more. It's the very end of chapter 4. It's verse 26. Right, and this is the pasuk, the sentence right before our Torah reading begins today. And I'll go back. I want to focus on verse 26, but I'll rewind back to verse 25. You can follow along with just your ears or your eyes as well. Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son to name him Seth, meaning God has provided me with another offspring in place of Abel, for Cain had killed him. Boo, we don't like that. And to Seth, in turn, a son was born, and he named him Enosh, and it was then that men began to invoke the Lord by name. And so we have the Hebrew, Az hu halikro b'shem Adonai. And I was like, what does that mean? I've read this parsha so many times, but I didn't notice this sentence this way until this year. And it intrigued me more. Looking at our Eitz Chaim commentary, we have a couple of different commentaries, as I've talked about, but on page 29, only 2 of them appear. I had a teacher who called it simply and I think helpfully, the above-the-line commentary and the below-the-line commentary. There, if you look in the introduction to this book, there are more technical names, but the above-the-line commentary and the below-the-line commentary, just to keep it simple. The above-the-line commentary says very simply, this expression refers to the worship of God. So interesting. There was a time in human history before which we did not worship God, but then, after Seth gives birth to Enosh, it was at that time that men began to invoke the Lord by name, that humankind begins to worship God. Now we get into the below-the-line commentary, and things get pretty complicated. Here we go. Once people became numerous, they began to form communities to share their hopes, joys, and fears. Kind of like this one. Hirsch, Samson Raphael Hirsch, is one of the few commentators to agree with the positive interpretation of this ambiguous verse. Okay, secret that all you will now know. The above-the-line commentary is actually taken from the JPS Torah commentary, which is much more extended and detailed and academic. I looked at that commentary, and it's like multiple. This says the expression refers to the worship of God. I'm now looking at the above-the-line commentary on the same verse, and the extended commentary is like paragraphs and paragraphs. And I was like, whoa, I can barely start to make sense of this. But the idea is that there are lots of ways to interpret this verse, and most of them are bad. Most of them are like, this is huhal likro b'shem Adonai. That's a bad thing. But Hirsch, Samson Raphael Hirsch, says this is actually a good thing. So most others, now I'm back in the below-the-line commentary, most others take the word translated as began, huchal, in its other sense, meaning to desecrate or to blaspheme. So basically, instead of this invoking God by name, they start to make creations and idols and say, oh, the work of our hands is really awesome. Who's this God? Whatever. We can make stuff and we don't need God. So thus, the Midrash understands the text to mean that people began to call the work of their own hands God. The further the generations were from God's intimate encounter with Adam and Eve, the more remote God seemed to them. They were lacking ways to recognize God's presence in their lives, which is the exact opposite of the interpretation from Hirsch, because coming together in community, invoking God by name, sharing our hopes, joys, and fears, that brings us closer to God. That's definitely not blaspheming. But again, most of the interpretations are negative, which makes sense, I guess, because at the end of the Parsha, God is like, let's get rid of humankind, this isn't working out. So Maimonides, another great scholar of the ages, traces the origin of idol worship to this stage of human development. As people came to depend on nature to sustain them with food, they were inclined to honor nature. So, for example, worshiping the ground, the plants, the sun, the rain, instead of worshiping God who creates all these things. Another midrash, understanding the text as referring to God's name, suggests that in the age of Enosh, people worshipped idols, but God tolerated their sin because there is no mention of punishment. So I'm thinking about being a parent or a teacher, right? There's like the stage of kids doing something wrong where you're like, this isn't great, but let's just kind of let it slide. And so maybe at this point between God and humankind, it was like that. But in the days of Noah, things get worse. And so this is why when you're a parent or a teacher and the kids start doing something where you're like, this isn't so good, you gotta keep a close watch because things might get worse and then you have to intervene. So in the days of Noah, however, people were cruel to each other, which God would not forgive. So that's the end of the comment. There is so much more that could be said, and that's why our weekly warm-up class is going to be much longer than 10 or 15 minutes. And so I want to close with a little bit more gratitude. gratitude for this in relation to this idea of invoking God by name. Thankfully, it's a good thing for us to invoke God by name, and it's important for us to step away from what can be like a human tendency, I would say, to praise God when life is good, but to blame God when life is bad. And our tradition teaches us that we express gratitude for both. And when we call on God, we start with gratitude. And today, in addition to all the gratitude that I have for specific people within our community, I have gratitude for, and I hope you all join me in feeling this way, grateful for life, grateful to be Jewish, grateful that we have our state of Israel and the land of Israel. And are any of those things perfect? No, they aren't. But when we're alive, when we are here, we have the chance to partner with God to continue to make our world better. And that, I hope, is the aim of our existence today and every day. And with that, I hope it's a good and sweet year ahead and that we continue to work to make it so. Shabbat Shalom.